Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are on the first update 2.2 dev server, and it's time to have a look at the ZTZ-99. This is the new top ranking vehicle for the Chinese in update 2.2. It's going to be battle rating at 10.0 and has a lot of similar features to some of the vehicles that we already have in the game, namely the ZTZ-96 and also the ZTZ-96A. One of the main things that it shares with its predecessors is the gun. It has a 125mm Type 88C cannon, and this has exactly the same ammunition as its predecessors. You start off with a Heat FS round, the DTP-125. You also have access to a HE round, and then you have access to the 125I. The HE shell is the DTB-125. It's a 45mm penning shell, and pretty good for donking people if you're able to. And the 125I or Dash I is an incredibly good APF SDS round for 9.3, and at 10.0 it still should be able to hold up with its wonderful stats of 466, 393, 269mm of penetration respectively, with a muzzle velocity of 1730 meters per second. Now, one thing I must stress when it comes to this vehicle, this was not on the list for vehicles which would be available on the dev server, and also I believe it's missing a few certain features. This thing doesn't have access to MVDs, this thing does not have access to thermals, so it would not be surprising to me if this gets access to them in the future, but right now on the dev server it does not. It does get access to smoke grenades and a laser rangefinder though, which are quite nice on it. It has 8 smoke grenades which drop off in sets of 4, then also has access to the 12.7mm and the 7.62mm coaxial. When it comes to the armor on this machine, it is pretty impressive. The upper glacis is first of all mounting explosive reactive armor, the FY4, with 140mm of kinetic energy munitions protection, and then 450mm of chemical protection. The turret itself on the front also has some ERA with 75mm kinetic protection and 250mm chemical. Then on the sides of the turret, it has even different ERA with 50mm worth of kinetic protection and 350mm of chemical. Very similar to its counterparts that it has earlier in the tree, and it also has the composite armor of 20, 530, 45, 50, 20 on the turret. At least the turret cheeks, not a lot of armor around the breech itself. And then on the lower area, it also has access to 20, 104mm and 60mm of armor. This thing has a very strong upper glacis, it has very strong cheeks, at least from the front, and that's pretty much it. When it comes to the driver's hatch, when it comes to the lower glacis, when it comes to the breech, these are all weak spots of this vehicle, just like a lot of other vehicles for the Soviets and also for the Chinese. It also has access, as you can see, to the auto loading system, which is standard for these vehicles as well, the horizontal loading system, so at least it isn't vertical, meaning that it would be much easier to hit. I think, at least for me, after using stuff like the T80, the T72 and also the ZTZ-96, this one gives way more survivability than the other. The other thing as well is it does have access to an autoloader. So that autoloader has a reload of 7.5 seconds. What this means is no matter what happens to your crew, no matter what happens to your crew skills, this thing will reload at 7.5 seconds, which at least is pretty decent for the machine itself. It weighs just over 50 tons and has a 1200 horsepower engine to move it around the place. This means it can go 60 kilometers an hour forwards and 6.3 kilometers an hour backwards. So it still struggles in the reverse department, which a lot of these very similar MBTs do so, unfortunately. But at least with engine upgrades, you should be able to motor around with pretty decent acceleration around the place. It also gets access to ESS, which is always nice on the vehicle itself. that is something to be lauded as well. Not everything gets access to ASS. It's kind of a forgotten thing, especially since thermals can look straight through it, but it gives it an extra bit of survivability against stuff such as certain helicopters and also definitely planes. Also has access to the general skins that all of these Chinese vehicles do. The tricolor camouflage, at least in my opinion, is always a favorite to be able to put on these things, but it does get access to some ones which you can grind out, and does get access to ones which are 200 GE each. So the great thing about the ZTZ-99, the fact that it is here now, means that you now have what is getting close to some form of top tier lineup. You can run this machine at 10.0, the ZTZ-96A alongside it, and the ZTZ-96, and you can have a full MBT lineup. And the gun is the same. You know, as you can see, there's a little bit of a bug here where the gun doesn't line up with my cursor. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that'll be fixed. But the main thing is you'll be able to now run a 3 MBT lineup where they all have the same gun characteristics, where they all have the same rounds, so you'll be able to get used to them. Just every time you go to the next one, it'll be a little bit slower than the last, or a little bit less when it comes to the armor department. This machine will have decent armor looking forward, even against stuff like the Leopard 2A6 round, which will not be able to pen its upper glacis at certain points. And because it has that extra horsepower in the engine, it will be able to get to positions quicker, it will be able to engage the enemy in decent places, it will be able to push forward and do pretty well with its other Chinese vehicles. It doesn't mean that the problem for China is solved though for its top tier. It still doesn't have a 10.7 vehicle for ground, and the gun depression for stuff like this vehicle is not exactly great, but it's okay. You know, it could be worse. The main thing is when you compare China to a bunch of the other tech trees, e.g. stuff such as the Americans, such as the Germans, such as stuff such as the Soviets, it still is nowhere near that level, but it is a step in the right direction. It is a step towards what we would class as parity for vehicles like this. It is a step towards something which would at least mean that you can run the Q5 in ground forces instead of have to toil away in Air RB with that vehicle. Now we're finally getting, you know, lineups at high tiers. Now we're finally getting the components which would make China fun to play at high tiers instead of having to rely on just 1 or 2 MBTs. At least now there is a third that you can run with the lineup. Now all that China needs, well, all that China needs, it needs a lot of components, but the main one that it needed was some kind of other MBT to push it up in BR for the Q5 and for other machines. But one of the major things it needs now is obviously radar guided AA. It is lovely to see machines like the ZTZ-99, and it also means in future updates it will be very easy to add stuff like the 96B, which we are missing, and also the 99A, which don't add too many things to vehicles like this, but you know, it means that they can be easily added because they just do, you know, little tweaks here and there, beefing the lineups even more. Think about like the Type 90 and the Type 90B. But at the same time, there's still pieces of the cog missing. There's still such stuff such as radar guided AA, IFVs, tank destroyers, helicopters, CAS, a lot of stuff for China which needs to be added to try and entice people into playing this, instead of being in a situation where you have one or two parts of the clock but can't make a full one. Hopefully at some point next year we see parity for China. Hopefully after 2 years of China being in the game they will have some form of top tier lineup. Hopefully then we will see the power of some of these vehicles. And if you haven't tried China, I would highly recommend this. As a person who has ground out and spaded the ZTZ-96, I would definitely recommend playing it. If you like the T-72 series of tanks, it is just a slightly better T-72A at the same BR. The 96A also now with its reduced modification costs because of the fact that it has access, you know, to not being the end of the tree. so it'll have reduced costs, and then the 99 on top of it, plus the PTZ that they just added. There are so many nice little quirks in China with different lineups, such as the 87 one, the 80 one, the 37, the 57. There's so many different things to enjoy about China. I really do think it will eventually become a very good treat to play. A lot of people talk about China being copy and paste. Well, here's a vehicle which is completely unique and completely Chinese based. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Elove Goat, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez B. Young, and also Hans Vergellen, Sebastian Mizon, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.